spend much time going through his credentials. His credentials are very well known. He's someone personally I've known for 25 years, and he's always been a leader that leads from the front, and he will do so again this evening. Premier, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Stavros. Program Director, Minister of Public Enterprise, Minister Gordhan, MECs, MEC Pillay, MEC Mavimbela, Co-Chair of the KZN Growth Coalition, Mr. Moses Tembe, and Andre Kepiela, our mayors, especially the mayor of Reinkonyeni, the host mayor, Mr. Mkati, all representatives of municipalities, including officials, chambers, Durban Chamber, Maritzburg Chamber, Zululand Chamber, and all others, CEOs of public entities, and all of you colleagues, or there is Ladysmith Chamber of Commerce. My apologies. So, distinguished guest, just 3 points. I'm a student of communication, by the way. So I know how to encode a message. I know, you don't drag, you don't deal with a lot of things, and you always understand the audience. So my first point, I know your state of affairs. You had a long day, yet the night is still young. And my second point, and I'm sure that most of you will support me, those who have been in this growth coalition. We need to give a big round hand of applause to MTN. We thank you. You've been with us, and you have shown commitment. But for me in particular, I must thank you for being with the government of KwaZulu-Natal. In a period of 2 weeks, this is the second event I'm attending, hosted and supported by MTN. 2 weeks ago, just after finishing debating the SONA in the legislature, I was blackmailed seriously by MEC Mavimbela. I had a long schedule, serious meetings. But MEC Mavimbela said, oh, you are trying to apologize in this event because we are welcoming back the girls who represented us in Africa. And I felt it, so I went to the event where we welcome the under 16 of Peter Maritzburg, yes, the team that represented us in Africa, the Interdependence Tech, and that was sponsored by MTN. And we want to thank you for that support. But they also represented us very well in Africa. I think they were the second. And you will see, so in football, if you ask that we are second, no, we are nowhere. We'll always, I'm not trying to speak. I know that football these days is not good for many of you. And the program director was so provocative. He was standing here, and behind him, it's yellow and black. And then he talked about Dr. Kumalo. Just after the last week experience, and worse after the yesterday experience. So happy people, just remain happy even now. No magunzima nje we are happy, ne? So but I wish to thank you, Mashobani. We thank you for your support. My last point is introduction. Honorable Minister, you are meeting here today with KZN Growth Coalition. It is a structure that was established years ago under the stewardship of the then Premier Sihle Zikalala. It started from that time coordinating business and government at a strategic level. We have sustained it till this far. Its purpose is to plan on strategic issues and feed to the KZN Economic Council, which is a form of your network in the province. It is composed of business leaders of key companies in the province, as well as the chambers and the government, which include the Executive Council, as well as the mayors, the mayor of the metro and secondary cities. We've had a long day discussing a number of things, but what we agreed, I believe we all emerged from that engagement with a shared conviction on pragmatic state, a state that will work to make it easy for investors to invest, a state that will drive change. With us is General Mkhwanazi, who made a detailed but strategic presentation on safety and security, assuring the business community that we will not see KZN reverting to what we saw in July last year, but that we will work for stability going forward. And at the level of government, we also detail our plans which talk to the strategy of the province for the next 3 years, but also for the future of the province. So we don't just plan for 5 years. We're guided by the Freedom Charter, the NDP, but we also have learned that you can plan and have plans. There are things that, while you have planned, they will just emerge without just any expectation. And one of those disruptors was COVID-19. And therefore, we have said we must plan for the future, take lessons from the past, but not everything will be informed by the lessons. Thus, we have agreed to learn and unlearn and shape our future together. My last part, colleagues, is to introduce the minister. Minister Pravin Gordhan is known to all of us. He grew up in KwaZulu-Natal and studied here in KwaZulu-Natal. He played a great role in the liberation struggle of South Africa, both in the underground structures, but also in the negotiations leading to 1994 democratic breakthrough. He has led various institutions including SARS, and led with integrity, ensured the safety of the fiscals of this country. You have led in various portfolios in government as a Minister of Culture, as a Minister of Finance, and today he's addressing us in his capacity as a Minister of Public Enterprises. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Minister Pravin Gordhan to address us this evening.
I see, Premier, that this thing called the mask hasn't reached KwaZulu-Natal yet. But the B2 Omicron is still around, ladies and gentlemen. But good evening, and let me greet the Premier and thank him for his kind introduction. MECs Pillay and Mavimbela, Mr. Moses Tembe and his partner in crime, Mr. Kumalo, who puts yellow behind this. And I don't want to risk missing out any of the chambers, so all the chambers that are present. Because in case I visit you, you say, but you didn't mention me. And the various CEOs that are present, the mayors, including our host mayor, and General Nkwazi, who I was looking for in July, but never quite found him. But, it's nice to meet him here. So I was working underground then as well, as some of you know. Thank you very much for the privilege of addressing you. I'll try to be as short as possible, although I've got about 50 pages here, but we'll see. That's in typical KZN tradition, you see, that some of you might know, some of you might not know. It's fascinating, Premier and ladies and gentlemen, that MTN is your sponsor, because it takes my mind back to, I think, 1992 or early 1993. 1992 was CODESA, and there was a planning committee of about 10 people, I think half ANC and half the National Party then. So it's one of those periods, I couldn't pin it down as everybody was talking about MTN. And the two negotiators, Mr. Mayor and the current president, Mr. Ramaphosa, were really arm wrestling. Because the issue was there's another cell phone license to be issued. And who gave the National Party consent to decide on their own in the middle of the negotiations about the future of this country? And if you ever saw our president engaging in brinkmanship, that was it. I was chairing that meeting. And eventually the matter was settled. So that's your legacy, you see, as MTN. It started then. Now I stand between you and dinner, but there were still other spirits that you want to engage in. So let me be very mindful of that. And you place me in a very unenviable position. But I would like to congratulate the Growth Coalition. It's survived a long period of time with many complexities. And today is a moment in time when this kind of gathering, and perhaps with even more people, with safe social distancing, is needed more and more, as the Premier was pointing out, in order to find not the differences, but the common grounds amongst us. Because what's missing in this country at the moment is each of us pointing fingers at the other. Now that's fine, because I think we all have complaints about how government works, or how capital works, or how business doesn't do things, and business will complain about labor, and labor will complain about business and government as well. But the complaints are one thing. What the country requires at this point in time is indeed this kind of coalition, where your slogan, growing together, is an extremely appropriate one. And this lays a good foundation, as Mr. Pillay was saying, for further collaboration, but perhaps within a different paradigm from the ones that we are used to. And it's crucial that the Economic Council that was being spoken about earlier on is made a success of, because those are the institutions that must survive all of us, just like the Growth Coalition has. Because without institutions, those are organizations, values, rules of the game, if you like, society begins to lose its way. And those who want to create chaos in this country are the ones who want to break down institutions, who want to violate values, who don't want to talk about integrity in government or in business. And read any book you like of any substance, and I'm going to introduce one to you a little later, and you'll find that institutions play a key role in society. I imagine many of you visit a bookshop every now and again, and there's a book that's been around for the past few years, which is called Why Nations Fail, Asamuglu and Robinson. Not too many shaking heads, but get hold of one, because it tells us about the importance of what they call inclusive institutions, which is what you are attempting. And what are the dangers of exclusive institutions, where elites get together, look after themselves, and forget 90% of the population. And that's the challenge I think we have, even in the Economic Council. How do you deepen that so that the populace begins to understand that they will be beneficiaries of the processes that are taking place in the Council itself? There's absolutely no doubt that both ourselves in South Africa, but the world at large, is at a critical juncture. There's a world in crisis. There's the after effects of the pandemic, which has sharpened the fault lines that have been not only in our country, but throughout the world, even in the most developed countries. You see poverty, you see massive inequality between the 1% and the bottom 50%. Read any book of any substance, you'll find that there as well. And if reasonably middle-of-the-road publications, like the Financial Times that many business people read, which I follow from time to time, can talk about the necessity for change in the economic system that results in this kind of effect, says so, then I think we must recognize that the pandemic has also left us with a serious set of challenges. The military conflicts that are occurring now, because they are happening on the doorstep of Europe, or Western Europe, as you can see, has had ripple effects throughout the world. Oil, $130. But there's the other kind of a ripple effect, if you're in the mining industry, that you are great beneficiaries of. So one of the biggest coal miners in this country phoned me 2 days ago, I want more trains to Richards Bay. Why? Because coal started above $200 for a ton, fell to about $160 for a ton, and 2 days ago, I don't know what the price is today, was $450 for the ton. So that means revenue for government, but it also means massive profits that are accruing to these firms. But hopefully the firms themselves don't just pass it on to the shareholder, they also look at other stakeholders who should benefit from this kind of windfall. There's, as I said, as a result of all of these factors, you have a massive destabilization, economically speaking, socially speaking, and congratulations to Stavros for his efforts to bring students out. I hope you're not going to go there to try to resolve the conflict. But interestingly, there are approaches to South Africa now to say, can you play a mediating role because of the history of mediation in our own country? But food is the next one on the target list that will be impacted. And all of us, including Mr. Ikona, will have to start looking at how do we keep food affordable for the middle classes and the working classes and the poor, because that's going to be the next challenge that impacts upon us. So we are at this moment where we must recognize our own crisis, the crisis of inclusivity, the crisis of growth, but one that actually benefits all our people, a crisis of well-being for the majority of our population. And as we get more reports from Judge, he's now Chief Justice Zondo. You might have seen the President's announcement today. The various reports on state capture, we begin to see both what happened in the last few years, who the beneficiaries were, who the enablers were, and what the impact on various institutions have been. Now, on your mind is probably, this fellow is supposed to explain to us, when are we going to stop load shedding? But I'll get to that. So we are at a point, ladies and gentlemen, as many of you have already said, which recalls something John F. Kennedy said in 1962. He says, and possibly that's the outcome tomorrow of this meeting or this gathering. He says it's time for a declaration of interdependence. So it's not about each of our sectors. How do we recognize the interdependence of all the role players, both in this room and outside of this room? And how do we make sure that we overcome the kind of crises that COVID-19 left us with, the challenges of geopolitics and geoeconomics around the world, the battle between the US and China for hegemony, and a return to what we used to call a couple of years ago a unipolar world, where there's only one boss, so to speak, and one policeman, and one assertive player. On the other hand, there are others who have the same aspiration as well. And how will that competition impact upon us as a country is one of the crucial challenges we have. The thinking, since Stavros talked about economists, well, there's economists and economists in my experience, and there's a lot of rethinking that's happening in economics at the moment. And we've all grown up to believe that economists have all the answers. You remember what the Queen said prior to or just after the 2008-9 financial crisis. So what happened to you chaps, the economists? Why couldn't you predict this was going to actually happen? So that question still stands out there, but there's some very innovative thinking that's going on. And if I went into some of it, you're going to really fall asleep. I saw some yawns earlier on, so I'm very careful about that. Technology, urbanization, the type of education our people receive, globalization and the impact of globalization, both positive but also negative in exacerbating inequality, in isolating vast sections of society, have all had interesting impacts, so to speak, that all of us need to evaluate at some stage and ask, well, what does it mean for the kind of compacting that is reflected in this room and the attempts that are reflected in the province itself? So one of the crucial issues that the President is talking about and around which there's a fair amount of energy being put into at a national level, and it's good to see that it's reflected at a provincial level as well, is the question of a social contract or social compact. And the compact, I'll get into this in a moment, but the key thing for us to recognize is that the situation we find ourselves in does not require us to only merely bounce back or build back better, as Biden says, return to business as usual, and reboot previous programs. It's time for fundamental reforms and not patching up the existing system, whilst we're still flying the aircraft, so to speak. And the question is, what does this mean concretely? How do you reflect it in your discussions in the Economic Council and in the practices that we have at a day-to-day level? Tough issues for us to deal with, but ones that business leaders and leaders in society and in government have to take cognizance of, because we can only, as elites, carry on for a particular period of time before the majority of the people start saying, I notice what you're doing for yourself. What are you doing for me? So that's the critical factor that all of society across the world is faced with. What are our efforts, whether we are in business or whether we are in the labor unions or in government? What are you doing for the majority of people in any situation that you find yourself in? And one of the lessons of this period that we've been going through is that both globalization on the one hand and the pandemic on the other hand, and the various sort of economic cycles that we've been through, actually reproduce poverty, joblessness, and inequality in societies. Very few societies have bridged gaps, except some of the Nordic countries and some of the Asian tigers, as they're often called. And some would say that we are at an intersection, and Ravi Pillai talked about inflection point, with roads leading in irreconcilably different directions. It is time to choose whether we continue hurtling down the road that will lead us to escalating crisis and dystopian outcomes, or whether we turn in a new direction that leads to healthier and more inclusive world of shared prosperity. And I'm quoting here Ian Golden. He was many years ago the head of the Development Bank of South Africa, but today he is an eminent professor at Oxford University and a prolific writer. So I think that's very appropriate for where we find ourselves in, today. So I certainly agree that we are at an inflection point, but the question is, how do we all see this inflection point in the same way? Do we all understand the crisis the same way? And if you look at the State of the Nation address by the President, he is actually appealing to all South Africans in SONA that the crisis that we face around joblessness, inequality, poverty, exclusion, economically speaking, is one that all of us as a society need to recognize. And he calls for what he termed a new consensus amongst ourselves. We've given it different names tonight. But in essence, that's the point we are at. And in that kind of situation, leadership plays a critical role. Who leads? What kind of vision do we lead with? And how do we ensure that we create a common purpose amongst all of ourselves? Because if leaders are aligned, then the rest begins to follow. Certainly, if people at an ordinary level begin to see the benefits of what we are doing. On the other hand, if they see one detachment, so to speak, benefiting on its own, which sometimes is what is happening in South Africa, then they're going to ask the questions that I've asked before. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are lots of lessons to learn from this period and the period behind us. But before you think I'm ducking the issue, let me cover some of the things that you wanted me to cover, I'm sure. So when is Transnet going to get going with the many projects that we are talking about in KZN? Tomorrow the CEO is going to address you, but let me give you a broad idea of where things are heading. Firstly, the Port of Durban is recognized as an important flagship hub port. But we have to, as KZN constituencies, make sure that we create a climate where there are going to be private sector players combining themselves with Transnet and with government more generally, and perhaps your government as well in KZN. But how do we create conditions where they feel comfortable investing their money in KZN and in the Durban port? Because in the next 10 years, there's a massive number of billions of rands that are potentially available to spend. The responsibility we have is to create the right climate, to make sure that whether it's the forum or other players, and I'm glad that you're beginning to see them eyeball to eyeball, are not going to play a disruptive role, are not going to upset the apple cart like in July last year, and who are going to welcome these developments. So in relation to creating a world-class deep water port, an RFQ has already been out. That's a request for qualification. That will be followed by a technical solution phase. That's what these guys are calling it. Secondly, in relation to Durban, the focus will be on containerized goods and the auto sector. Richards Bay will play a different kind of role. But the containerized goods includes agricultural exports, which is doing extremely well at this point in time. And some of it is going to be held up because of what's happening in the north and have an impact, but they'll have to find alternative markets. And we need to make sure that our ports, particularly at the terminal operation level, are efficient enough to handle the load, which they're not at this point in time, let's be frank. One of the big concerns that Transnet has, I share from my previous work at SARS as well, is the large number of second-hand cars that are landing at Durban Port, which allegedly are going to neighboring countries. But we all know many of them are ending up in South Africa, avoiding excise duty and the various customs duties that are actually involved, and compounding the problem for auto sales as well. My own view is that we should ban the import of second-hand cars. You see, that's called radical. And, but there'll be, I'm sure, a very upset constituency somewhere. So be it. But I won't go into details. There's lots of games that are played in that terrain that we are very familiar with today. The South African Navy will be relocating to Richards Bay, so that frees up the Salisbury Island area. And those negotiations took many years, but they were concluded last year. In addition to what happens in the port, there need to be road and rail solutions to be found so that there's efficient transfer of containers and other goods to the rest of the logistics chain. The Port to Gauteng rail operation will soon have announcements made, if they haven't made it already, where the private sector will be given, I think, 6 slots on that particular line to operate so that we can enhance both revenue for Transnet on the one hand, but also if they are more efficient than what Transnet is doing, then they begin to set a new bar that Transnet staff will have to start meeting as well. It might be the other way around also, but let's see what happens. So that's an interesting innovation that's going on. At the harbor, there's lots of movements of the fuel situation to Richards Bay as well, but there'll be what is called a commonly used fuel import terminal with what is called, Transnet is calling democratized access, means all players who want access to the terminal can get access to it. And then, of course, there's the operation of the pipeline. Now, with the fuel prices being what they are and oil prices being what they are, and we'll only know I think later in March what the impact is, whilst the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy and the Minister of Finance are reviewing the formula and the manner in which fuel prices are actually calculated. But thieving from that pipeline is becoming a serious problem. So I was told that there are 3,000 kilometers of this pipeline in different directions. The first incident took place I think 2 days ago, where there was such sophistication in the way it was operated. So now Transnet Pipeline has put massive concrete slabs to cover these pumps or something that they have near the Vaal Dam and the Vaal River. These guys brought in hydraulic jacks, lifted the slab, got access to what was the pump inside, stole probably about 300,000 liters, left it open. The diesel was flowing through at that point in time. That diesel went into a tributary of the Vaal River, could have ended up in the Vaal Dam and contaminated water supply. Fortunately, Transnet picked up the fact that the pressure in the pipeline was dropping. That means there's a leak somewhere, and very quickly sent in the right contractors and so on to hold back the movement of the diesel and then suck up the diesel before it got into the Vaal River itself. And that, of course, cost a lot of money. But there was a second incident in the last 24 hours elsewhere as well, which means that theft and sabotage, if you like, or vandalism is one of the big problems that we are confronting as far as some of these key facilities are concerned. Part of the reason, for example, for the slow movement of coal to Richards Bay is that rail line, North Core, by Transnet, is plagued by vandalism, theft of rail infrastructure, communities invading some parts of the railway line, and now a lot more money will have to be spent. And I've got to talk to the coal miners to put some of that money forward because they're making a lot of money anyway. And Transnet is beset by the legacy of state capture. So all of you would know about the 1064 locomotive deal, the majority of which were supposed to come from two firms in China, and they've combined now, and others from GE and I think Bombardier, it's called something else now, and I think Alstom has bought them off. And because there were these commissions paid, some of the money is frozen by the Reserve Bank. SARS wants to lay their hands on that money as well. Transnet wants that money as well. But the more important thing is that there's R1.5 billion worth of spare parts in South Africa, but you can't touch it. And so if those locomotives that have been delivered need to be repaired, you can't have access to spares. There's no maintenance contract with the Chinese, and there's a gridlock. So bottom line is that, as you'll probably hear the details tomorrow, we don't have enough locomotives for all of the different rail operations that Transnet is involved in. I had a meeting with Transnet 2 days ago to see if they can find some interim solutions, but that's plaguing us. Similarly, maintenance of cranes or straddlers and so on. All of these issues are coming to the fore now as challenges. So it's not tardiness on Transnet's part, it's overcoming this legacy, because the legacy is a very concrete one. As far as Richards Bay is concerned, that's a major bulk port. There's also a port plan that they've developed there. An RFI was issued on the 21st of February in terms of development of the port. And I've spoken about the challenges in relation to coal, but Richards Bay is going to play an important part in the import of natural gas. And the quicker we do that, the better, because it'll help us to address the climate change commitments we've made, but also supplement the sources of energy that we actually have. But there's a bit of instability around some of the communities in that area. So we'll have to talk to you, Premier. Maybe the CEO will do that and see what we can do with that particular regard. As far as Eskom is concerned, the generation side is presenting huge challenges. A couple of days, well, towards the beginning of the week, you suddenly had, the week before, everything was running smoothly. From about Monday onwards this week, just on one day, about 12 units collapsed for one reason or another. Boiler tube leak, this leak, that vacuum not working, etc., etc. And they're still battling to overcome. No sooner do they recover 4 or 5 of them, another 3 would become problematic as well. The fundamental issue is that we required, from about early 2020, another 4,000 to 5,000 megawatts of spare capacity, which until today we don't have for Eskom. That would have permitted the right kind of maintenance to take place, but I think we're reaching a point where some special interventions are required. So I'm going to say too much about it now because we can't carry on at this rate. Energy security is crucial for the economy, for business, and for households as well. When you have almost 90% of the population supplied with electricity in one form or another, everybody feels the impact of this load shedding. So all I can do, and let me make it clear, I don't operate Eskom, but I try to see whether we can push them to do whatever is possible by speaking to the board, speaking to the senior management. 2 nights ago, I met with all of the power station managers, all the senior executives, and on Sunday night, I hope to meet with the board to see what other solutions can we come up with to solve this problem. But there are serious issues there. And there are serious issues of corruption there today. So there are 3 identified power stations, I'm not going to name them, where virtually everybody is corrupt for one reason or another in that environment. They keep changing managers, but lower down, that disease is still there, that cancer is still there. So because we think we've gone past state capture, as a society, we haven't gone past corruption, whether it's in the private sector or public sector, or in these institutions. And so a lot of work needs to be done in that particular area. SAA, we've revived it. It was nice. I flew on SAA to get here this afternoon. And the staff is very happy. They have jobs. Some of them came to me to thank government for that. And pretty soon, we've signed the purchase and sale agreement. We now have to go to the Competition Commission and the Civil Aviation Authority. Once those 2 things happen, hopefully sooner rather than later, it'll be 51% owned by the private sector. So I think it's a good story about restructuring but not killing, and trying to revive it with a partnership between government and the private sector, and government having the humility to recognize we can't operate airlines. Call the private sector in. Hopefully they don't make a disaster of it. I'm sure they won't, but they'll get there. Another crucial issue that we are often critiqued for is the question of, you're not doing enough reforms in the country. But let me just take you through about 7 or 8 of them. Firstly, Minister Ntshavheni has done a remarkable job in a very short period of time to get the spectrum auction going. So you see, you didn't speak about that today. Because he is one of the beneficiaries, his firm, eventually, of allocation of spectrum. Secondly, all of that is predicated on migrating from analog to digital. And it's been gazetted that by the 31st of March, all analog TVs will be off. Set-box, or what do we call them? Set-boxes, yes, will be provided to those people who can't afford them. And there's about 1.3 million people who have registered for that. And we're well on our way with something that has taken 10 years. So within a very short period of time, that's moving. The corporatization of creating a separate entity under Transnet of the Ports Authority, that happened last year. We're about to appoint the new board of this entity, and that will begin to take on its own identity. We said 2 or 3 years ago that Eskom's transmission operation will be separated into a separate subsidiary for now, and it's called now the South African Transmission Company. The deadline was the 31st of December, 2021, and the deadline was met. The separate entity has been created. Now we move on to the rest. But we still require, if somebody has the appetite for it, another 100 to 150 billion rands worth of investment to extend the grid in South Africa. So that, for example, more renewable investments in the Northern Cape can be more easily connected. But there's an innovative idea that Eskom has come up with. There's a lot of land around power stations. So they've identified which power stations have what land that can be auctioned to the private sector. That process will start soon as well. And renewable plants can then be built on that land, and the grid facility is like next door, so to speak. So it's very easy to connect to the grid and get extra energy supplied. But there's, as Stavros was saying, I think we need to bring you in to cut some of the red tape. There's too much of regulatory red tape that I think is holding up investment in this area of renewables. And when I talk to different constituencies, there's something like 40 to 50 billion rands waiting to be invested in renewables from the private sector. So we need to enable that. I'm not sure what KZN can offer in that particular regard, but it's something for you to actually think about. Pretty soon, there'll be a basis for, what shall we call it, for exploration in mining to take on a new kind of dynamic. And the minister will announce some of that stuff. An infrastructure fund, we've been talking about it, as the president says, for 10 years. It's now been created. It's got R1.5 billion in it. But there's a pool of projects that has been created in the infrastructure agency, which runs into, I think, almost R1 trillion or something like that. But the next step is getting that done, passing through the different phases, because once that gets going, we're going to have, I think, a massive amount of jobs being created on the one hand, but also optimism, both in the business sector and amongst our people as well. And the last point I want to make is all of this that I'm talking about involves the private sector in one way or another. So it's a different set of opportunities that are opening up, and different kinds of creative private sector participation needs to take place across some of these areas. And as the Premier and Mr. Pillay pointed out earlier on, the basis for many of the things that we are talking about is the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, which was negotiated in NEDLAC and then became a government program. There are also new opportunities through the efforts of the Trade Industry and Competition Department in terms of activating the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I'm not sure what the vibe is, so to speak, in KZN in that particular regard, but that's fascinating stuff. Agriculture is another area which, if you look at the latest GDP figures, has played a very big part, both in respect of exports, but also in respect of productivity as well. Mining, except for December, is increasingly playing its part as well. And what we need to do, as I pointed out earlier on, is to get the logistics side working much better than what it is doing at the moment. Investment in the industrial area, whether it's Aspen expanding their operations to now get into the vaccine fill and finish business. And pretty soon, I imagine, they want to get into the manufacturing of the actual active ingredients. Localization, so India is saying made in India, the USA is saying made in the US, and Europe is saying something similar. So there's a lot of critique among some columnists about localization. But if you're not going to do things here instead of importing them, how are you going to build the economy here and industry here? So there needs to be a different kind of balance that needs to be struck. And equally importantly is the issue of crime, because crime creates instability, it creates uncertainty, and there are too many talented South Africans who are beginning to feel that they need to go elsewhere in order to practice their professions. And we need to create a climate where we hold on to the skills while we build new skills in South Africa, and a new generation of people who are able to tackle the new kind of economic dynamics that are going to emerge, and create new, apart from mining and agriculture, create new types of industries based on new technologies as well. So all of that is fine. The question is that the current situation, as we called it, the inflection point, has created a crisis mindset in populations in South Africa, but elsewhere as well. It's created volatility, so you can't really predict which way things are going to move. The wrong type of populism can feed on that and create political issues and political instability as well. And all of this raises the question that some of us used to read through a man called Lenin before, what is to be done. So we need to build, in my view, what I call operational trust to enhance the compacting process. What do I mean by operational trust? I go back to our negotiations after Madiba was released. And after the first few tussles between him and de Klerk, once the negotiations proper got off, they collapsed in May 1992. Okay. I suppose that was necessary to keep you awake. So, yeah. So operational trust means that if Madiba was going to, or de Klerk was going to attack the ANC or Mr. Mandela, he would send a message first to say, I'm going to attack you, so be ready for it. If we said, we're going to meet tomorrow, we're going to discuss this issue, this is the possible solution we've agreed upon, it will happen. It doesn't mean I trust everything you do. But we trust each other enough to get the process moving. And that, I think, is the missing ingredient at the moment. None of us is going to trust the other completely until we get to know each other better. But by working together, as was pointed out earlier on, we can build operational trust. And that's perhaps something and that's South African grown, by the way. We didn't get anybody from the United States or United Nations or anybody else to negotiate our constitution. We negotiated it ourselves. This constitution and the interim constitution, which reflects the political settlement in South Africa, was done by South Africans. We learned from all over the world, but we did it ourselves. And the same applies to what we have to do now. So we need to find common ground, but more importantly, act on that common ground, not just talk about it. Because it's action that builds confidence. And it's action that builds trust, and we get to know each other much better. One of the key challenges I've been telling colleagues on my table is how do you balance self-interest with societal interest? And that's another missing ingredient. We can all chase after the bottom line, more profits, more money, more dividends, etc., or higher salaries and bigger bonuses. That's good. But if that becomes 99% of your preoccupation, and you forget about the 50 million or 45 million South Africans that are battling day to day, then that self-interest is not going to take you too far. So part of this compacting process is to recognize how do we balance self-interest and societal interest. And social compacting is not about ourselves. It's about creating a better environment for society at large, whilst we find agreement amongst leaders from different sectors as well. What's also coming through in some of the literature is increasing productivity. So the private sector people here will acknowledge that. And the question is, that's partly related to technology, it's partly related to skills, it's partly related to the kind of management you have. And if I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong. I'm quite willing to learn from you. But at the end of the day, we need to become more productive as a society and as firms and in government in particular. There's too many lazy people that we pay full salaries for. So even during the pandemic, lots of people lost their jobs, but nobody in government lost their jobs. Lots of people had to take 50% cuts in salaries and rely on TERS benefits and so on. Nobody in government had to do that. So we had our full salaries. Do we actually give our full commitment in every branch of government to the kind of work that we actually need to do? Because that will cut red tape a hell of a lot. I thought the private sector guys might applaud that, you know. But the major challenge that we still face and that the compacting process must lead to is inclusivity. Whether it's inclusivity in the so-called deals or inclusivity broadly in the economy, unless we cross that river, unless we put up bridges that can enable us to cross that river, we're not going to move in this country. So where's the leadership going to come from? Where are the new ideas going to come from? And how do we prove that there's greater and greater and greater levels of inclusivity? There are more enterprises amongst black communities. There are more innovative things that are actually happening there. And what does the inverted commas existing or old private sector and government itself do to encouraging those enterprises to develop? Because you can't get jobs without enterprises, right? So we all talk about job creation, but the jobs are either created by existing entities or new entities. Big entities are not going to give many more jobs. I'm sure the big captains here, I don't know why they call you guys captains, by the way. Maybe because you're a port city. But it's the medium-sized and small-sized businesses that are going to create jobs. So how we multiply them and how we support them and how we enable them and sacrifice a little bit of what we have, because we've been around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, is going to be a key ingredient for ourselves as well. An explicit fight against corruption and crime is absolutely crucial. Not enough people are being charged, not enough people are being investigated, and above all, not enough people are finding themselves in orange uniforms. My apologies, General Mkonazi. But that's the truth. Society wants to see the crooks behind bars, right? And the criminal justice sector has to work far more efficiently and, inverted commas, productively to take us in that direction. And finally, we need to find the courage and the imagination to lead these processes. So we will all agree here that certain things need to be done, but how many of us are going to stick our heads up above the parapet and say, I'm willing to say this publicly, I'm willing to do that publicly, I'm willing to lead in this particular area, whatever the difficulties might be. And that's when people look for all sorts of places to duck and dive, so to speak, if I may speak colloquially. So leadership plays a key role, and the right kind of leadership in this environment as well. And I believe the Growth Coalition gives you a basis for what you've done already, but also what needs to be done. There's a chap called Jared Diamond. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar. He's written lots of books, and he presents 12. I'll read some of them to you. Interesting issues in a book called Upheaval. So the first thing he says is acknowledgement that one is in a crisis is critical. Acknowledgement is simpler for individuals than for sections, because in the former case, that is amongst individuals, one does not have to reach a consensus among many citizens. Right? So recognizing that we are in a crisis. Secondly, and this is key, accepting responsibility. Avoid victimization, self-pity, and blaming others. This is true for nations as it for individuals. You might want to think about that here as you go into tomorrow's session. Thirdly, building a fence of selective change. He discusses 6 countries in his book, and he says that these countries dealt with crises by adopting selective changes. Fourth, help from other nations. This can play a positive or a negative role in resolution of most crises. Fifth, using other nations as models. This can be significant positively or negatively for most countries, and I think we can learn lots of lessons, but we can also teach lots of lessons from South Africa as well. Sixth, national identity. A shared sense of national identity is important. So one of the questions in some of the discussions I've been having recently that somebody raised is, are we 2 nations in one country? Now, you remember President Mbeki used to talk about that many years ago. Are we back there? Or are we in a position where we're going to find the right kind of moral and economic and governmental leadership that ensures that all of us have one identity, we have one national purpose, and we support one flag. I think in soccer we might, but there's some other sports. But this question must not be underplayed, because that then helps us to take collective responsibility for the future of this country. And he has other criteria here which I won't go into. There's a fascinating book, and I'm going to conclude on this, otherwise you're really going to kill me. And some of your growling stomachs are coming to me now. There's a fascinating book written by a Professor Shafiq. She's currently the director of the London School of Economics, but she's worked in the World Bank, IMF, Bank of England, and in many other capacities as well. And the title of the book is What Do We Owe Each Other? Interesting. What do we owe each other? So if you ask that question at each table, what do we owe each other? And essentially she's arguing in this book that in the modern world today, the social contract has failed, and that a new type of social contract is required. And she uses the approach of cradle to grave, that at each stage in our lives, what do different role players need to do to enhance the well-being of all of the people in a society? So she says, or she raises some key questions and considerations that we need to think about much more seriously. And she says that the overriding premise of a new social contract that we owe each other more. We need to increase productivity, as I said earlier on. We need to rethink fiscal policy. In other words, how do we pay for the social contract and the things that we owe society at large? And a new social contract needs to be crafted with business. And getting there, of course, we'll have to contend with the politics of a new social contract as well. Now, I've got the last chapter of a book here, but I'm not going to share it with you now. But in essence, there's lots of lessons about social compacting. I would encourage all of you to try and get hold of a copy of this book about how do you traverse this terrain of social compacting, which is absolutely essential for our country. And just one part that I want to share with you. The first is that paradigm shifts play a very important part. In other words, what's the world view, or what's the camera lens that we are looking through the world at, or through. And we are at a moment, because we're at this inflection point, which requires a different way of thinking, a different way of doing things, and perhaps different ideas as well. So all of you in the business sector and elsewhere would know the answer to this question. Do you still get Motorola phones? What happened? They were, 20 years ago? The leading phone in the world, right? The other one that was leading was Nokia. What happened to Nokia? Barely see it now. Because they didn't ever think that the thing called the smartphone will ever come. What happened to Kodak film? It's gone. And Kodak, if it still exists today, it does, has to adjust itself to a new world and new technologies as well. And those who underwent the paradigm change, Ericsson said, cell phones are not my business after losing out. So they concentrated on infrastructure. They're now in trouble for having dealings with ISIS somewhere in the world. China then went on and created its own capabilities, Huawei, which I don't know, what market share do they have in South Africa? Yeah. So that's why they kicked out of America, they kicked out of parts of Europe, because they've become too clever, too dynamic, too innovative for the older firms that are operating there, and of course they use security as a key concern. So I'll just go through one section after promising not to go into it. So I'm very open with you. So a new social contract with business should focus instead on creating more winners by investing in education and skills, by bringing better infrastructure to deprived areas, and by promoting innovation and productivity, all of which reduces the need for redistribution and compensation. While part of the new social contract will be achieved through public spending, and part through regulation. Part of it must come about by changing what is expected of the private sector. So the private sector also has a critical role as we go forward in this particular regard. Let me conclude by saying the following. So I'm jumping, 20 pages now. You see, I've come well prepared for KZN. So I want to suggest to you that it's time to reflect upon but also reimagine the opportunities that we have and think positively about the resources we have as this country as a whole. I don't mean mineral resources only. We have massive resources in this country. We have massive talent in this country. The way we handled, as Stavros described, the pandemic was world-leading, both from a science point of view, but also in terms of a response point of view as well. How do we build on that? It's time to impart hope and trust as leaders. So that finger pointing that I was talking about earlier on must be done very silently. But how do you create hope, notwithstanding the challenges that we have, that we can overcome these challenges if we do certain things right? Otherwise, we are all dead, and we all fall into, then we'll have to go to Stavros for those antidepressants. Now, you don't want to make Aspen any more richer, you see? And avoid the antidepressants anyway, they're bad for your health. So creating hope and building trust is going to be critical. It's time to look at how businesses can grow, but also the manner in which they grow, and how do they promote inclusivity, but make South Africa a dynamic system as well. There's another book which is one of many today that's available. Those of you who read the Financial Times, you just look at a guy called Martin Wolf and his 2020 list of books, and you'll see most of them are focusing on inequality, are focusing on reshaping capitalism as it exists, and this is about saying South African capitalism needs to review itself. And so there's a book, I just forget the first name of this lady, but her surname is Anderson, who's writing about this phenomenon as well. Do we have lessons to learn from there? You be the judge once you get the book. I'll try and get the name for you by tomorrow morning. It's time for collaboration and sharing and working jointly, which I think we all recognize. And it's time to seize the opportunities to be inclusive, to expand, and to distribute in a particular way that creates decent jobs, decent lives, and dignity for people. Dignity is very important. As you know, even a simple job that gives income creates dignity for people at the end of the day. And that dignity we must not take for granted. That dignity is something that all of us should take responsibility for. But above all, it's time for collective leadership, and as Diamond was saying, collective acceptance of responsibility, and above all, we need to act. Martin Luther King in 1967 said the following: in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men, can include women as well from our point of view. So all men and women are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. And that shows the interconnection. So we might want to ignore the masses of society and say, as long as I make money for my company, I'm okay. But if you follow this ethos that Martin Luther King is talking about, then we have to think very differently. Finally, I want you to take encouragement from what the President had to say, that we require a new consensus, and I quote, "This also should be a new consensus which embraces our shared responsibility to one another and acknowledge that we are all in this together." So all luck and strength to the Growth Coalition, to the Premier and government here, and to all of you as business leaders. You might produce perhaps a provincial compact that might act as a leading example for the rest of the country, and I hope you do. Thank you very much.
Minister, thanks very much. You know, one normally tries to summarize at the end of each speaker. I'm not going to make any attempt at that, not least because I could risk the ire of the audience as dinner is about to be served. But I think a very common theme that came through of the many insights that you gave us is compacting, collective leadership, and I think that's what this conference is all about. You've also spoken a lot about the need for action, and I think that is critical, and I think it's going to give us a very good segue after dinner into the discussion we're going to have and some of the questions and comments you might receive. So, Minister, thanks very much. You gave us many insights into the top-selling books. And before we take dinner, the one that you said is the London School of Economics lady. What do we owe each other? Okay, we owe each other dinner. So dinner is served. Can we start with tables 1, 2, 3, and 4 first, please? Thanks very much.